In the shadows of 1700s Virginia, whispers spread of a family bound not by honor, but by a love deemed forbidden. Neighbors claimed their children bore the mark of sin, faces too alike, bloodlines tangled in secrecy. But behind the walls of their plantation home, a story unfolded that would blur the lines between passion and damnation. A tale so taboo it haunted their descendants for generations. Welcome to Eerie Records, where we peel back the layers of forgotten history to reveal its darkest truths. Tonight, we unravel a forbidden tale from colonial Virginia, where love, sin, and secrecy shaped a bloodline cursed from the very start. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of night you've joined us. Subscribe now and become part of the Dark family. Virginia in the 1700s was a land of contradictions. On the surface, it was the proud jewel of the colonies, endless rolling fields of tobacco, elegant plantations rising from the earth like monuments to wealth, and families who carried themselves with the dignity of European nobility. But beneath that polished exterior, darker realities pulsed quietly, shaping lives in ways no one dared to speak aloud. The era was defined by strict order, social, religious, and familial. The church was not just a place of worship. It was the center of law, morality, and surveillance. Every whispered rumor, every suspicious glance could find its way into sermons that condemned entire households. To live in Virginia was to live under a constant, suffocating gaze, the neighbors watching, the church judging, and the land itself demanding labor and sacrifice. Plantation families stood at the top of this rigid hierarchy. Their wealth, tied to tobacco and the exploitation of enslaved labor, gave them immense influence. They were supposed to be the epitome of honor, pillars of faith, order, and family values. Yet behind closed doors, these families were not immune to temptation, secrecy, and sin. The very same walls that displayed portraits of respectability also held whispers of hidden shame. Life in rural Virginia was isolated, and isolation has a way of twisting desire. Families lived miles apart, surrounded by endless forests and rivers that seemed to cut them off from the world. Social gatherings were rare and often confined to church days or market trips. For the young, especially, opportunities for connection were limited. In such suffocating seclusion, the lines between family, friendship, and forbidden attraction could blur dangerously. And in this backdrop, where reputation was everything and exposure could mean ruin, any step outside accepted norms became a risk. Families feared not just divine punishment, but the devastating power of scandal. To be caught in sin was not only to risk one's soul, but to risk losing land, influence, and status forever. This was the Virginia of the 1700s, elegant yet oppressive, powerful yet fragile, outwardly godly but inwardly filled with desires too dangerous to name. It was in this soil, fertile with both tobacco and temptation, that one family's secret would grow, a secret so forbidden, so unthinkable, that its shadow would stretch across generations. And as night fell on those plantations, with candlelight flickering against tall windows and the creak of wooden floors echoing through empty halls, no one could have guessed that behind those locked doors, a bloodline was being born, not of honor, but of forbidden love. In the Tidewater region of Virginia, wealth was measured not in coins, but in land, in slaves, and in bloodlines. To hold power in the 1700s was to own not only the fields that stretched for miles, but also the people forced to work them. Among these families stood one whose name carried weight across the colony. They were respected, envied, and quietly feared. This family's estate rose like a fortress above the James River. Its halls were filled with imported furniture from England, polished silver on long dining tables, and portraits that gazed down with stern pride. To outsiders, they appeared to embody everything the colonial elite aspired to be: pious, disciplined, and destined for greatness. They were seen in church every Sunday, their carriages rolling up with precision, their children dressed immaculately, their patriarch greeted with deferential bows. But power always comes with shadows. Behind those manicured gardens and heavy oak doors, the family's story was far from flawless. Wealth could buy land, influence, and silence, but it could not always contain human desire. And in a world where bloodlines were sacred, every secret romance or whispered betrayal risked tainting the legacy they fought so hard to preserve. Their control extended beyond the plantation. The patriarch's voice carried weight in county courts, in church councils, even in local militias. With one signature, lives could be altered, debts forgiven, reputations destroyed, fortunes shifted. Neighbors relied on their approval, but also resented the chokehold such influence placed on community life. Few dared to cross them. And fewer still would have believed that beneath this iron grip of respectability, the seeds of scandal were quietly taking root. The daughters of the household were expected to marry well, uniting their fortune with other great estates. Sons were trained from youth to manage land and slaves, to uphold the family name with unyielding pride. Every move was scripted by expectation, every smile rehearsed for appearances. The family's future was not just personal, it was political, binding together networks of wealth and power across Virginia. Yet, it was within this rigid framework that something unthinkable began to stir. Hidden in the silence of the estate's long corridors and private chambers, desire pushed against duty. One forbidden bond, if ever revealed, could unravel everything: the land, the reputation, the power carefully built over generations. This was the paradox of a family of power in the 1700s, outwardly invincible, inwardly fragile. And within their walls, behind their painted smiles and sacred family portraits, the most dangerous story of all was just beginning. It began, as so many dark stories do, in silence. The family estate in Virginia was vast, with endless halls where shadows lingered and whispers carried. Among the servants and enslaved people who moved quietly through its rooms, one figure stood out, not because he spoke, but because he listened. He was young, strong, and intelligent, a presence impossible to ignore. Though his name would never be written in the family records, his existence would etch itself into the bloodline forever. The youngest daughter of the house, scarcely 17, was expected to embody grace and obedience. Her future had already been decided: an arranged marriage to a wealthy planter, one that would secure the family's influence for another generation. But the heart rarely obeys the rules carved by society. In the quiet stillness of dusk, when the house was hushed and candles burned low, her eyes met his. It was a glance too long, a silence too charged. Something dangerous had been set in motion. Forbidden love in the 1700s was more than scandal, it was peril. For her, discovery meant ruin, exile, even disownment. For him, the stakes were far deadlier. The laws of Virginia were merciless. Relationships that crossed the rigid boundaries of race and class were punishable by imprisonment, public whipping, or death. Yet danger only seemed to deepen the attraction. What should have been impossible became irresistible. Their meetings were secret, carved into stolen moments. A brush of the hand as he handed her a book. A quiet exchange in the garden, shielded by tall hedges. The thrill of footsteps echoing in the hallway, and the relief when no one saw. Love does not always shout. Sometimes it hides in shadows, growing stronger precisely because it must remain unseen. But houses remember. Servants notice. Walls carry whispers. The family's grand estate was a cage of eyes, and secrets could not stay buried forever. A misplaced letter, a lingering glance at the dinner table, a servant who saw too much, any of these could unravel the delicate thread they balanced upon. And yet, for the young woman, the risk was worth it. For the first time in her life, she was not a pawn in her family's game of power. She was a girl in love, and for him, caught in a life of servitude, this forbidden bond was more than affection. It was defiance, a stolen piece of freedom in a world designed to crush him. What began as a glance had become a fire, one they could not control. And while the world outside their secret meetings remained rigid, cold and merciless, inside those stolen hours, they created a universe of their own, a universe destined to collapse under the crushing weight of 1700s Virginia. Whispers have a way of traveling faster than truth. In the Grand Virginia estate, silence was never truly silent. Every creak of the wooden floor, every shadow on the wall seemed to speak of secrets. The young woman's glow did not go unnoticed. Her sudden absences, her uncharacteristic defiance of household expectations, these things stirred unease among the watchful eyes around her. It began with small murmurs. A maid, carrying linens through the corridor, noticed the girl slipping into the garden at unusual hours. A cook overheard faint laughter where there should have been none. Even the enslaved, who lived under the weight of silence, felt the tension, because they knew that any discovery could bring punishment upon them all. Secrets in such a house were not private matters. They were dangerous sparks, capable of burning down an entire legacy. Her family, too, began to sense a change. At the dinner table, her eyes no longer drifted toward the wealthy suitor they had chosen for her. She had grown restless, distracted, her gaze often lost in thought. Her mother whispered to her father about her unusual behavior. Her brothers, protective and proud, began to watch her closely. In a household ruled by honor, even the smallest suspicion was enough to send icy dread through the halls. And then there was the young man himself. He had grown bolder, perhaps too bold. His duties brought him close to the family, carrying messages, tending the grounds, managing tasks with silent precision. But his eyes, dark and watchful, lingered too long on the girl. Others began to notice, though no one dared speak it aloud. After all, to suggest such a thing was to summon scandal of the most unforgivable kind. Still, unease seeped into the walls. One afternoon, her elder brother followed her down a corridor, his footsteps quiet but firm. He watched as she paused near the servants' quarters, her face pale yet lit with a secret kind of joy. He did not see the young man, but he sensed something unspeakable. The brother said nothing, but his suspicion was born, and suspicion, once planted, never dies quietly. The family began to tighten its grip. The daughter was scolded for being too free. Her movements were questioned. Plans for her marriage were hastened, as though her parents sensed the need to secure her future before scandal could strike. What they did not know was that it was already too late. The forbidden bond had taken root, and secrets once whispered were beginning to rise like smoke from a hidden fire. And as the house grew watchful, the lovers grew desperate. For every wall that closed in, their need for each other grew stronger, and desperation, in the shadows of the 1700s, often led to ruin. By the spring of 1707, the Virginia estate felt less like a home and more like a stage. Every glance, every whisper, every locked door seemed to carry the weight of suspicion. The young woman's secret could no longer be hidden by lowered eyes or quick excuses. Her body had begun to betray her. Soft curves where there had been none. A faint glow that no candlelight could disguise, the family noticed. At first they brushed it aside, clinging to denial. Perhaps she had grown ill. Perhaps she was simply tired. But mothers know their daughters, and hers knew the truth before a single word was spoken. The question was not if, but how. Who had planted this shame? Which man had dared? Fear gave way to fury. A wealthy suitor, recently promised her hand, began to suspect betrayal. He asked questions. Servants were interrogated. The estate, once filled with quiet routines, now hummed with tension. Doors slammed, voices rose. Every creak of the floor seemed to announce that a storm was coming. And the young man, the lover, felt it too. His once secret world was closing in. He avoided certain corridors, avoided certain eyes. Yet still, he found himself drawn back to her, unable to resist the pull of a bond that had already sealed their fate. They met in hurried whispers, hands trembling as they touched, both knowing each embrace might be their last. One night, the girl's elder brother confronted her. His voice was low, filled with the kind of restrained rage that comes not from ignorance, but from knowledge. He demanded the truth, but she offered none. She could not speak his name aloud, for to do so would mean his death. And so, she bore his anger in silence, her tears falling like confession. Rumors soon escaped the estate. Neighbors noticed her changed form, whispering at church pews, exchanging glances in the market. In 1700s Virginia, a scandal was not a private shame. It was a public execution of reputation. Families could be ruined, fortunes destroyed, names forever tainted. The patriarch of the house, desperate to protect his legacy, began to make plans. He would find out the truth, no matter the cost. The suitor pressed harder, demanding answers, demanding blood. Servants were threatened with violence if they dared withhold secrets. Fear spread through the estate like wildfire. But truth is a dangerous thing, and when it begins to unravel, it rarely stops at one thread. Because the secret that bound the lovers was no longer theirs alone. It had become the obsession of everyone around them. And in that kind of darkness, tragedy was inevitable. The summer heat of 1707 was heavy, pressing down on Virginia's plantations like a suffocating hand. Inside the grand estate, the whispers had grown into voices, and the voices into accusations. The girl's condition could no longer be cloaked in shadows. Her swelling form was undeniable. The shame her family had feared was now visible, etched into her very body. Her father, a man of stern reputation and rigid pride, gathered the household. His voice shook not with weakness but with rage. He demanded answers, his cane striking the floor like a judge's gavel. The suitor, red-faced and humiliated, stood at his side, insisting that this betrayal be revealed. "Who?" he thundered. "Who has defiled this house?" The girl trembled. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. To speak would condemn her love to death. To remain silent would condemn herself. For the first time, she felt the walls of the estate as a prison, every eye fixed on her, every breath waiting for her to break. And then someone spoke. A servant, trembling, pointed not at the suitor, not at some distant name, but at him. The young man who had lingered too often by her side, whose stolen glances had not gone unnoticed. Gasps filled the room, horror mingled with disbelief. "In the name of God," her mother whispered, her voice cracking. The revelation struck like lightning. Not only was the girl with child outside of wedlock, but with her own blood. The word incest was not spoken, but it hung in the air, heavier than any storm. In 1700s Virginia, such sin was not only scandal, it was blasphemy, a curse that could damn a family's soul for generations. The father's fury erupted. His hand trembled as he raised his cane toward the boy, striking him once, twice, before servants dragged the young man to the ground. The suitor, pale and shaking, demanded blood. "This is not only betrayal," he spat. "This is an abomination." The household descended into chaos. The girl collapsed, sobbing, clutching her stomach, as if her embrace could shield the unborn child from the hatred that now filled the room. Her brother's eyes, once filled with quiet suspicion, now burned with disgust. Her mother wept, not for her daughter, but for the family name that would never again be spoken without shame. Outside, the neighbors were already whispering. Rumors traveled faster than any carriage, reaching the church, the tavern, the fields. By morning, the scandal was no longer confined to the estate. It had become public knowledge. The family, once respected, was now cursed in the eyes of Virginia society, and the lovers, once hidden in shadows, were dragged into the cruel light of judgment. The scandal spread like wildfire across Virginia. By the time the sun rose, the estate was no longer a place of quiet, prestige. It had become a stage for whispers, prayers, and curses. Men gathered in the taverns, shaking their heads, calling it a sickness. Women crossed themselves, muttering that such a sin could not come from flesh alone. It must be the devil's hand at work. The family, desperate to contain the ruin, turned to the church. But in 1700s Virginia, the church did not offer comfort for such sins. It demanded punishment. The minister, an austere figure cloaked in black, arrived with scripture heavy on his tongue. He did not sit with the family in mourning. He stood tall, condemning their bloodline as corrupted by wickedness. The father argued fiercely, his pride refusing to yield. Yet even he knew what the verdict would be. No plantation, no wealth, no reputation could erase what had been done. The girl and the young man, bound not only by love but by blood, had committed an unspeakable act. In the eyes of the community, they were beyond forgiveness. The sentence was not death, though some cried for it. The law was inconsistent, but society's cruelty was relentless. The minister declared them banished. They would be stripped from the estate, cast out into the wild edges of the colony where whispers turned to silence, where shame was exiled to rot unseen. The night before their departure, the house was heavy with sorrow and anger. The girl's mother wept in silence, clutching a rosary until her fingers bled. Her brother, once protective, now turned his face from her, unable to meet her eyes. The suitor, humiliated and betrayed, severed his engagement in public, ensuring all knew he had been wronged. And the father, his rage had cooled into something darker. He stood over his daughter and the young man, his voice low, venomous. "You have cursed us all. Whatever child you bring into this world will carry not only your sin but the weight of eternal disgrace. Go, and may God show you no mercy." At dawn, the estate gates creaked open. The two lovers, hands bound together by rope, were led away under the watchful eyes of neighbors who spat, prayed, and pointed. The girl clutched her stomach, her unborn child stirring beneath layers of shame. The young man kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched, though the bruises from his father's cane still marked his skin. Banished, branded as sinners, they walked into the unknown. Behind them, the estate loomed, its windows like empty eyes, already erasing their names. Ahead of them lay only the wilderness, and the question of whether their cursed bloodline would die with them, or survive in secrecy. The wilderness swallowed them whole. No longer surrounded by polished wood and silken fabrics, they now walked through tangled forests, where the howl of wolves replaced the chatter of servants. Nights were long, damp, and cold, punctuated by the distant crack of branches that could have been animals, or men sent to hunt them down. At first, they found shelter in the ruins of an abandoned cabin. Its walls sagged, roof half collapsed, and the smell of rot hung thick in the air. But for the banished, it was more than wood and stone. It was survival. The young man repaired what he could, hands blistered from labor he had never known before. The girl, pale and trembling, learned to live with the echo of her father's curse, while her belly grew heavier with each passing month. Food was scarce, the forest gave little, and the villagers who might have helped turned their backs. They were pariahs, outcasts branded by shame. When the girl ventured near a settlement, whispers followed like shadows. Mothers pulled children close, muttering that to even look at her was to invite the devil. Coins were refused. Bread was snatched back. Even charity had its limits when sin was believed to run in the blood. The young man's determination hardened. He hunted with crude traps, caught fish with bare hands, and bartered scraps of labor for meager supplies. Yet hunger gnawed at them, a constant reminder of their punishment. At night, he whispered promises to his love, that they would survive, that their child would see a better world. But beneath his words was a fear he never spoke. What if the minister was right? What if their blood truly carried a curse? The girl's nights were haunted by dreams. She saw faces in the cabin's shadows, family portraits blurred and disfigured, as if the ancestors themselves had turned away. Her mother's voice called to her in sleep. Not in love, but in sorrow. You were born into sin, and sin bears fruit. When the first snow came, silence blanketed the forest. With it came a bitter stillness, broken only by the cry of crows circling above the cabin. The girl went into labor too soon, her body weak from hunger and grief. Hours of pain filled the night, her screams muffled by the wind. The young man, desperate, held her hand, whispering prayers he barely remembered from childhood. And then a cry, fragile, piercing, the sound of life in the midst of desolation. Their child had arrived. A bloodline that was never meant to be had survived the judgment of men, but perhaps not the judgment of God. The lovers looked upon their newborn, their hearts heavy with both love and dread. For in that tiny face, they saw not just hope, but the shadow of a curse carried into a new generation. The cabin walls groaned as though they too bore witness to the unspeakable. In the dim glow of a flickering lantern, the infant's first cry echoed through the wilderness, high, sharp, and unsettling. The young man held his child with trembling hands, staring at the fragile life that had come from forbidden love. His heart swelled with pride. Yet deep within him lurked a gnawing fear. This child was not only a blessing, it was a prophecy. The girl lay pale against the straw bedding, her breath shallow, eyes glazed with exhaustion. She looked upon her newborn and whispered through cracked lips, "He carries both our sin and our salvation." Her words, though tender, chilled the young man's blood, for he remembered the minister's curse, that their bloodline would forever be marked. At first glance, the infant seemed ordinary, almost beautiful, with delicate features and a shock of dark hair. But when the lantern light shifted, strange shadows played across the child's face. His eyes, though barely opened, glimmered with an uncanny awareness, as if he had come into the world already knowing too much. The mother reached out to touch her child, but when her hand met his skin, she shivered. "Cold," she whispered. "Too cold." Outside, the storm raged. Winds lashed against the frail cabin as if nature itself was protesting the child's birth. Crows gathered in unnatural numbers upon the barren branches, their cries overlapping in a chorus of mourning. The young man tried to chase the omens from his mind, but the world seemed to conspire in reminding him. This birth was not a blessing, but a reckoning. The days that followed only deepened the dread. The baby rarely cried, lying in eerie stillness, eyes following shadows no one else could see. At night, the girl swore she heard voices whispering from the rafters, unfamiliar tongues, calling out the child's name before it was ever spoken. When she asked her lover if he heard them too, he lied and said no. But he had. The villagers soon learned of the child. Word spread like fire. The cursed bloodline has borne fruit. They spoke of it in hushed tones, warning each other that the child's very presence would bring famine, sickness, or worse. Doors slammed shut when the young man approached, and prayers were muttered louder whenever the child's name was spoken aloud. Yet despite the whispers, despite the unease, the young man clung to a single truth. This was his son, his legacy. He swore he would protect the child from the world, even as the world sharpened its knives. But bloodlines do not escape their fates, and this child, born in sin, born in exile, would soon grow to carry the weight of both his parents' love and their curse. Years passed, but the stain of forbidden love never faded. The boy grew, tall and sharp-eyed, carrying an unsettling calm wherever he walked. Villagers avoided him, mothers pulled their children close, and whispers trailed behind him like a second shadow. "That is the cursed one," they muttered, "born of sin, carrying the mark of darkness." The young man, now hollow-eyed with age, did all he could to shield his son. He taught him the scriptures by lantern light, urged him to pray, to live quietly, to prove the world wrong. Yet deep inside he feared the boy's silence, for in that silence there was no innocence, only watching, waiting. The mother, frail and withered before her time, would sit by the hearth and tell her son stories of love and sacrifice. "You were born of us," she whispered, "and in you both curse and hope dwell." But as she aged, she often fell into trances, speaking words she did not seem to understand. She would repeat the same phrase again and again. The blood remembers. The blood remembers. Strange events followed the boy wherever he went. Crops withered after his touch. Fires flared without warning. Animals turned restless in his presence. And once, a crow perched on his shoulder and refused to leave. As though recognizing him as kin, the villagers spoke more boldly now, no longer afraid to curse him aloud. Some called for exile. Others demanded sacrifice. The father stood in their way, sword in hand, swearing no man would harm his son. But the villagers were patient. They knew time was crueler than steel. Soon enough, both parents grew too weak to fight. One night, beneath the harvest moon, the boy returned home to find the cabin silent. His mother lay still, her last breath gone. His father sat by her side, eyes wet with grief, but also with something else, relief. He looked upon his son and said, "Whatever you are meant to be, you must face it alone." With that, the father's heart gave out, leaving the boy utterly alone in the world. And so, the cursed bloodline was left to a single child, wandering Virginia's mist-laden fields with nothing but his shadow for company. Legend says he did not die, nor age, but lingered, an eternal reminder of the sins that birthed him. Travelers claim to see him on lonely roads, his eyes glimmering faintly in the dark, followed by the whisper of unseen voices. Generations later, his story became folklore. Parents warned their children, "Stay inside at night, lest the cursed bloodline finds you." But for those who listen closely, in the dead of night, beneath the trees of Virginia, a voice still murmurs, "The blood remembers," and the shadow of that forbidden love remains, eternal.